Go and do likewise. That's what Jesus said. And as I said, this parable is a really well-known parable. And many people have heard this story many, many times. And I want to draw out just a few ideas that when I was looking at it the other day, that I want to share with you this morning. And it's a crazy story. This series is Crazy Talk. That's what we've called it. And it's a crazy talk, a crazy parable, because in this parable, Jesus turns, it's very countercultural. Jesus turned it all around because the person that he was speaking to and telling this story to was an expert in the law. He was somebody who was working in the temple probably as well. He was somebody that he knew a lot about the Bible. So he knew a lot about the Old Testament, what we now know as the Old Testament. And it was crazy because the Samaritan is the hero in the story. And the Samaritan would be, in that culture, he would not be very well liked. It would be despised, particularly by the person that Jesus is telling the story to. And we have seen, as we read it just now, that the priest there just turned a blind eye to this person that had been robbed and was left for dead on the road. And then there was the Levite who did exactly the same thing, who left the person on the road. Now, a Levite is somebody who would have been in the temple. They would have had a role in the temple. They would have had as maybe leading times of singing psalms in the temple during the services. They may have been a teacher in the temple. They may have been also helping with the construction, the maintenance side of the temple. They had a massive role in the temple. And so for them to just be leaving the person for dead on the side of the road was not great. And they probably wouldn't have liked the fact that Jesus had said that the Levite had left this person for dead. But then Jesus brings the Samaritan man as the hero of the story. That was a crazy, radical thing to say at that time. And he asked the man, the expert in law, what does the law say? And the law said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, the word love in this context was, it's different to the English context because we've only got one word for love, which is, you say it for I love you when you say something to somebody, but you can always say, I love pizza, I love chocolate, I love your hair, I love your coat. We haven't got another word for love in our dictionary. But this word, in this particular passage, it was the Greek word agape, which is the unconditional love that the Father, the God the Father, gives to us, his children. It's an unconditional love, a love that the Father, the love of God, gives to humans. And you could say, actually, we're not capable of giving that agape love because we're not perfect. God is love. God is love, and he can give that unconditional love. But in this passage, Jesus is saying, love your neighbor with that unconditional love. It's not a warm, fuzzy, emotional love. It's a different kind of love. And there's an amazing book, if you haven't read it, it's called Love Does by Bob Goff. And in that, he talks about the love that I'm talking about. He says love is an action. It's a choice. It's a mindset. It's an attitude. It's an attitude of kindness. It's an attitude of generosity. And Jesus calls us to a love that moves. It's not passive. It's a love that does. It's a love that is generous. And I don't know about you, when you think about loving your neighbor, whether that's an easy thing for you to do or whether that's a difficult thing for you to do. But in the Bible, this is what Jesus is saying. We need to love our neighbor, whoever they are. And in Psalm 145, it talks about this because it says, God is rich in love and loving to all that he has made. That is all that he has made. So when he says, love your neighbor, he's saying we need to love all people, no matter who they are. And in this story of the Good Samaritan, he was kind of saying to the expert in the law that he was talking to love the Samaritans. Love the Samaritans. Love the people that you don't like. Love the people that you despise. You need to love them. And it's not easy, is it? It's really not easy. I remember a time when we were living in London. Si and I were living in London. We got 3 small children. We were living in a really lovely road, but we had a neighbour who was really challenging. Really challenging. She was called Elsie. She's now died and she's passed away. But she was a woman that I had to really... I'll tell you what she did. It was quite hard. So we had 3 small children. She would blare Magic FM at 3 o'clock in the morning out from her bedroom window, which was just near our bedroom window. And she would blare it out full blast. During the day, she would have the TV on. So when you're sitting in the garden, the TV would be daytime TV on all day, full blast. She would put a park outside her house. She didn't have a car, but she'd put cones along inside of the front of her house just in case someone came to visit her, which they didn't. And if you parked your car in front of her house, she would pick those cones up and plonk them on your car, and they'd scratch your bonnet. She is also known to deflate people's tires in the car. She would hoover, apparently another neighbour was telling me, that she used to hoover really loudly because she was in the next door terrace to her. Her house was attached to her house, and she would vacuum at ridiculous times of the night. And it was just a challenge for me living next to this woman called Elsie. But I knew that Jesus says, love your neighbor. Love your neighbor. And it's not very easy to do that when you haven't got that love, when you haven't got compassion. But in that psalm that I was just reading, in Psalm 145, it says, the Lord is good to all because he has compassion on all that he has made. That means he has compassion for Elsie. He made Elsie. And I wonder if you've got an Elsie in your life. And I had to really come to God and say, God, if I'm going to live in this house, I need to have some compassion for Elsie. And so I felt like we needed to go and visit her. So we would go, Si and I would go and visit Elsie and get to know her a little bit, get to know her story, because I needed to have compassion for this lady. And when she told us her story, I had compassion for her. That sort of annoyance and irritation for her changed to compassion, because the story was that 40 years earlier, her sister had run off with her husband. They decided they didn't want anything to do with her. She was estranged from her one and only son, who didn't want anything to do with her. She was lonely. She was addicted to alcohol, so she drank morning, noon, and night. She smoked about 70 cigarettes a day, and she was a bitter and twisted, resentful woman. Literally everything that came out of her mouth was resentful. And I just thought, I felt so sad for her that she was a lonely woman all on her own that didn't feel love at all. And I just thought, what an opportunity for myself and Simon to show love to this woman. I'm not saying it was easy. It really wasn't easy. But we could have this opportunity to show her the love of Jesus, put it into practice. So in order to love people, maybe we need to ask God, can you give me some compassion, please? Can you give me compassion in my heart to keep it soft and not hard and cynical? I wonder if you can think of somebody that you perhaps need to soften your heart for and love a little bit more. And in this story, the story of the Good Samaritan, it's not always easy to show that love, and sometimes it's a cost when we do. You know, sometimes it's a bit of time that you have to give. It's a bit of energy. It's not a passive thing, but it's a move. You have to move and make it happen. It's a change of the heart. It's a change of the will. And Jesus was telling these parables, as we've been hearing about over the last few weeks, as we said before, is to further the kingdom of God. It's to further the love that he has shown to us, to the neighbors that we have in our lives. But sometimes it's a cost. In verse 34, it said of this passage that he bandaged the wounds. He used oil and wine, which he would have probably had for himself, actually, on his journey. He put the man on his donkey. And I wonder whether that means, therefore, that he would have had to walk more himself, but he put the man on his donkey. And then when he got to the inn, he cared for him. He cared for him and spent time with him and looked after him. And then the following day it says that he was giving the innkeeper 2 silver coins to continue to look out for him. And he would therefore say, and went off, and then he said, I reimburse you a bit later on if there's any more expense. There was a cost. There was a cost, but he had compassion. But there was a cost. And I think there's often a cost when we look out for people, when we love others, even in our community, when it's people that we know here, whether it's people literally our neighbors, whether it's people at work, our friends, our family, sometimes there's a cost. Sometimes it's a financial cost. It's often a time cost. Sometimes it's just an energy cost. Sometimes it's a bit messy. Sometimes it's a bit emotional. It's quite emotionally draining. And it can be a cost. But also, it can be a cost for those receiving the care. They might feel like they're really vulnerable and they don't like feeling vulnerable. They might be feeling like that it's embarrassing or full of shame. There's a cost for the giver, but also the receiver. And I can imagine that man, the Good Samaritan story, he probably felt really vulnerable and really, obviously wounded and in pain. But this guy, the Good Samaritan, helped him and took him to the innkeeper. So we might need to ask for compassion. There is a cost in giving sometimes. But what I find that when we have compassion, there is a cost. There's always a change. There's always a change in our heart. And I think when I think about Elsie, when I went round to her, I felt like there was a real change that happened within me. And I feel like also there was a change that happened within her. She used to, if the TV was on too loud, I could go round now because I'd built that relationship with her. I could say, Elsie, just a little bit too loud. Do you mind turning it down a little bit? And she would. She would. And we'd invite her round. She often didn't come round to our house, but we would knock on her door and say, look, should we have a cup of tea together? And we just had that her change of heart was quite amazing. I wouldn't say it happened for the whole of the rest of the street, but for us, her next door neighbors, we felt like there was a change in her heart. And in this story, it says, show mercy and compassion. There's an amazing story that I was reminded about this week. I was watching a film, and it was about a guy called Graham Seed. And he wrote a book called One Step Beyond. And it's a story about him. He was brought up in Middlesbrough. He was brought up in a really violent background. He didn't see his dad much, if at all. And his mum, he didn't really have much to do with. He was left to go out on the streets. And at the age of 12, he was in a gang. He was taking alcohol. He was doing drugs. And also he became a football hooligan. He was a really violent person. He was always getting caught up with the police. And he ended up going to prison. And he went to prison, and he was always going in and out of prison. They used to call him, apparently, one of the worst offenders that they'd have to deal with in Middlesbrough. And he ended up, as he came out of prison one time, he ended up living on the streets, and he ended up sleeping on a bench on a particular road. He said he slept there for about 3.5 years. So a lot of people would have walked past him over those 3.5 years. And there was a group of Christians that used to go and sit on the bench with him and tell him that Jesus loved him. And he'd abuse them and run after them and just shoo them away. They had compassion for this guy, but it was a cost for them because he just abused them and ran after them. And what was so amazing is that when he had an incredible time in one respect, because what happened, he ended up being really ill, and he was taken to hospital in an ambulance, and he was in a coma. And the doctors and nurses got in touch with his mum and said, look, there's no way that we can keep him alive anymore. We've done all we can. And his mum said, no, I'd love you to keep that machine on for a bit longer, that's life support machine, because he's only 32 years old. And then this group of Christians heard that he was in hospital, the ones that used to visit him on that bench. They came into the hospital and they prayed for him. They prayed that Jesus would come and make him better, that he would breathe his life into his body. And you know what? He woke up. He woke up and he said all the addiction had left him. And when he woke up and he felt that all this addiction had left him, he wanted to find out about Jesus. So he went on an Alpha course. He gave his life to Jesus. And he now goes into prisons. The prison that he used to be an offender in, he was a prisoner, is now going into that prison. And he is doing the Alpha course and seeing people come to know Jesus. Isn't that an amazing story? It's an amazing story of change. Christians seeing on the bench compassion. Yes, it was a cost, but what a change. I'm sure it was a change in their heart as well. That must have raised their faith, raised hope, seeing a miracle like that happen. And I really believe that when we do love our neighbor, whoever they are, and maybe they're not going to be really difficult people to love, God often puts people in our midst that are easy to love, and that's fine. But sometimes when it's difficult, we need that compassion. But we can see the change I saw the change in my heart when it was so difficult to love Elsie. And I know that he does that. And we've seen that here at HTH Church, in our church community here. But on a Thursday, we see it at Safe Haven Women when people come in. It changes my heart. It changes the women that come through the door. They're seeing love. They're being loved. And their hearts are changing. They're becoming more confident. They're becoming more able to express themselves when they've got somebody they can talk to. And I know that's like the case also for Safe Haven Men, and also for our Ukrainian cafe, the Sanctuary Cafe that is happening at the moment. These people are learning to be able to be in this country for a bit longer, and they're being loved by many of us here in this community. It's amazing, the change. But as we know, Jesus is the ultimate Samaritan. He is the one that binds up the brokenhearted. He is the one that can heal our wounds. He is the one that can carry us and restore us. And I believe Jesus wants to do that for some of us here today. No one is off limits. You know, Jesus, he came to this earth for all. He died on the cross for everyone. No one is exempt from that. And he loves everybody that we come into contact with, even if we like them or if we don't. He has. And we know that love is powerful because God is love. And there's a song, isn't there? Love changes everything. But love is powerful. In John 13:34-35, it says, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples when you love one another. And I think in this church community here, we love each other as we do love each other. I believe we do love each other. And we love our town here. And we love the places that we're from, in the villages where we're from, in the neighborhoods that we're from. And I believe that the love that is shown in this town is having effect on it. People are being blessed by us as a church community. And there's always more that we can do in loving people. But this town is being loved and changing. And we want to have that more and more as we become more like Jesus, as we spend time with him, that love can ooze out of us. And when we're not feeling it, When we're lacking in compassion, we can draw on God's love because we've got the Holy Spirit. And one of the fruits of the Spirit is love, isn't it? And also we can draw on the power of God to pour in that love to us so that we can give it out to other people. And I just know that God would love to fill us again with that love so that when we can go out into our church and community